Here's a presentation that I gave to the 60th Symposium at the Bowen Center just a couple of days ago on November 4th. This is a longer version of the same talk, probably not too much longer. The talk was 20 minutes. I'll just be filling in any details that I wasn't able to in the original. The title is Barriers to Science for Bowen Theory. It is a look at some problems that appear to be there with Bowen theory through the lens of pseudoscience. The problem I'm getting at here, or the specific problems, are that Bowen theory does not enjoy scientific critique through, for example, driving peer-reviewed experimental research aimed at publication in well-respected academic journals. The claims of Bowen theory, for example, are so deep, are so big, that demonstrating that they may be the case would be worthy of publication in Nature, for example. There are any number of predictions in Bowen theory that would be worthy of that kind of publication. And it has not happened, and for, I believe, a lot of the reasons in this presentation. There does seem to be a disparity in age, at least in leadership. Most of the thought leaders, most of the leaders in the Bowen Network and training seminars appear to be past retirement age. Most of the attendees to the spring conference and the annual symposium and the international meeting do seem to be older, quite a bit older. And also, and maybe this is related to that, and this is really kind of an opinion, that the demographic of people who are interested in Bowen theory appears to be less technical. Meaning, there are virtually no engineers or people with formal scientific research training that are interested in Bowen theory. Now, that's not entirely true, but there is a disparity toward clergy, therapists, organizational consultants, things like that, people who tend to not have that kind of background. So these are the problems that I'm looking at. And so I'm going to lay this out in three different stages. First is markers of pseudoscience. I'm going to review some of those, how they may apply to Bowen theory, and then some ideas about what to do in the future. First, for markers of pseudoscience, Karl Popper is probably the best known author of pseudoscience, although I don't know that the word was being thrown around back then. But he was saying that science is essentially inductive. That means you have a hunch, you collect data on that hunch, you attempt to predict future data, and then you put it up for debate, for good faith critique. He's saying that good theory can't explain everything, that the more it attempts to explain, the closer it becomes to a belief system, that it has to actually risk something. False predictions have to have something at stake. And that good theory prohibits something rather than says that something will happen. It says what will not happen under specified conditions. And the more it prohibits, that is, the narrower in focus, the better. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, that ad hoc predictions prove nothing. That means that a prediction that only claims to have predicted a result once the result is known, that means it's not a false prediction, or one that is applied only to a specific case and not in a generalized fashion, is not proof. That is a form of cherry picking. Now I'm throwing Bowen in here as well in Kerr's book, Family Evaluation. In the epilogue, Bowen is writing about The problem of the erosion of technical terms, when terms like theory, hypothesis, and concept lose their meaning and have more to do with untestable opinions rather than specific devices that have to do with formal science. And that when these erosion is happening, you get repeated conceptual division within the in-group. That means that the people who are already biased towards whatever the propositions are just endlessly dividing and dissecting the existing concepts rather than testing them or looking for new observations. That there will be less contact outside the group, that the conceptual compartment, that is, that the concepts themselves don't make logical connection to concepts in other fields. And a critique specifically aimed at Freud, that Freud was a genius theorist and certainly made many observations for the very first time, and yet used concepts and their definitions directly from human mythology, human literature, human culture, instead of just trying to describe what was being observed in a way that really only pertained more to what was observed directly rather than ideas from the past. So Scott Lilienfeld and his co-authors produced a book on psychology as pseudoscience, or rather pseudoscience in psychology. And he might be the most prominent author of pseudoscience in psychology today. He's also talking about the problem of ad hoc predictions, the absence of self-correction, which has to do with the reverse burden of proof, that the person making the proposition has to actually provide the proof for the proposition, which is related to the tradition in English common law and our own judicial system, where the burden of proof is on the prosecution, not on the defendant. That there can be an evasion of peer review that is only putting the propositions and the research up to people who are already sharing the bias for them, as opposed to putting them up to good faith review, or not seeking any peer review at all, just claiming things to be so. An emphasis on confirmation rather than refutation, that goes back to Karl Popper's falsification criterion, that it must prohibit certain observations and risk having an incorrect prediction, that something must be at stake. Similar to Bowen, an absence or overlap or connectivity with other disciplines, kind of like Bowen's compartment, or creating problems that only you know how to solve. An over-reliance on testimonial or anecdotal evidence, that of course is going to be common in religions and belief systems, as well as many psychological theories, if not most or all clinical theories. The use of obscurantist language, meaning using terms that only the in-group, only the bias circle knows. Absence of boundary conditions. For example, hypothetically speaking, in Bowen theory, the entire globe is a network of interconnected triangles. However, when making a prediction based on triangles, it's easy to explain away incorrect predictions by just saying, oh, it wasn't some triangle in this extended family, it was actually one generation above or to the side. So there has to be some kind of a boundary condition on the prediction. It has to be limited in scope. That goes back to Popper saying it can't explain everything. The last one's pretty interesting, the mantra of holism, which uses the Rorschach inkblot test as the example. And I can back this up with my own training in my doctoral degree in clinical psychology, where we were literally instructed to repeat the phrase for when administering the Rorschach, that the results of this one instrument could not be taken out of the context of a full battery. Lilienfeld and co-authors are giving this exact example, saying that the problem is that any problems in the predictions in the Rorschach as a psychometric instrument don't stand alone. They depend on the validity of the other instruments in the battery, but the other instruments in the battery all depend on each other as well, and so nothing is predicted. This is going to be the same thing if you're talking about a system of people where the functioning of one depends on the functioning of the other through one or more feedback loops, and if one prediction doesn't come true or can't be validated, then you can always say that it was some other part in the system. This is a similar problem to the boundary condition problem. Here are some new examples or propositions of markers of pseudoscience from experience with Bowen theory in and out of the network of professionals who share the bias for it. The first is going to be, and probably the most important, the lack of explicit predictive models. This is a term that I had to come up with specifically for Bowen theory, but I think that it captures the final requirement of formal science, so far as the rest of the world sees the term. I carefully put this term together with explicit and predictive and models that each have their own definition. Explicit means it has to be material, it has to be outside the human brain. The calculation of the predictions that the models produces, that being the function of a model is to predict or simulate, must occur outside of the human. That is how you demonstrate that it doesn't depend on you, that it exists having more to do with the object in question, that's the natural phenomenon that's being observed, or the actual model, than it does with you. Predictive, as already mentioned, means predictive. It means that it's making predictions. These particular models are predictive devices that simulate the natural phenomenon in question. Model sort of speaks for itself with the previous two terms, but it means that you're making something that is not the same thing as the phenomenon in question. It's not an actual family. It's not an actual weather system. It's something you've built to represent that reality, that real object. So this is explicit predictive models. The point of this problem, this marker of pseudoscience, is to differentiate for real knowledge that can be used to build technology or not. If there is technology that depends on the underlying theoretical model, this requirement is met because the technology then becomes the model. And the technology works sometimes and doesn't other times, maybe, but that's the nature of models. So just to repeat it, that an explicit predictive model requirement says that you must build something to demonstrate that you know what you're talking about. It must operate as a simulation, a prediction. This goes back to the Newtonian tradition, where Newton actually demonstrated in material form that he knew what he was talking about. He left the instructions for the experiment and left the data required to perform the experiment. This requirement implies that hypothesis testing is model building, period. There was this idea from Bowen about getting beyond math and trying to acknowledge the limitation of concepts derived from the human brain. And ideas that had more to do with the human brain than they did with nature. And these statements and ideas had their point from Bowen, these statements from Bowen. I think that a problem that emerged as time went on was that can be taken to mean that once you start using math and statistics and you start using engineering skills to build models, that it's no longer Bowen theory. I'm arguing here that it's more complicated than that you cannot formally test a prediction until you actually do a formal calculation of that prediction, and formal literally means the form has to be outside of your body. It has to be material. It is the application of engineering skills that makes hypothesis testing happen. It requires technical training in whatever problem domain or whatever domain of skill that is required for that particular model. For example, if it's a complex systems model, then you're probably going to need skills in software engineering or skills in using software that require the skills in software engineering. Hypothesis testing is model building, period. All of the subsequent markers here follow from this one. Another marker is going to be that new explicit predictive models do not propagate and flourish on their own. This is getting at the way of the market of ideas works. When there is a solution that works for a valuable enough problem, it is automatically picked up. When there are an explicit predictive model or explicit predictive models that have to do with a very important problem like individual mental health, and those models have limitations, which they always will, then other engineers, other researchers are automatically going to come along and try to improve them. That's what it means by new explicit predictive models, variations on the theme, or at least an attempt to attack the problem from a completely different angle. And this has to be related to the problem of attracting technical talent, that there are not droves of engineers pursuing this theory, and that leadership is almost completely untrained in the kind of highly technical skills required to work on these kinds of things. There are some people who have some social science training. There are a few psychologists, but there are no explicit predictive models that are automatically propagating by the focusing of technical talent and attention on these kinds of problems. Another one is going to be where explicit predictive models decrease, or rather attention in explicit predictive models, developing and testing them, decreases while attention to and interest in application increases. Application, of course, has more to do with reusing old knowledge, old technology, and a focus on the models themselves and improving the models, that is, improving the formal state of the art, would be the other end of that spectrum, where that has more to do with the pure inductive mode of generating new knowledge. The last one here on this slide is a funny predicament that I found myself in. It took me probably 3 years, maybe a couple of years, to figure out that this was even a problem, that this was even occurring. That's deducing an explicit predictive model from an already formulated theory, a theory that's already in place, particularly a very complicated and sophisticated theory, which Bowen theory is, with its interlocking concepts and all of its internal consistency. The pure inductive mode is where you gather evidence, you make a prediction, the prediction requires a model by definition about future evidence, and then you put it up for debate. Then the theory is based on what's been demonstrated in the model. The model consists of the most formal version of that experiment. Everything else is speculation. Everything that doesn't have a demonstrable basis is speculation. Theory, especially in the context of human behavior, very often goes far off into speculation while claiming to be a formal theory. Bowen theory is no different in this regard. And a marker for that is finding oneself in the situation of trying to find a complicated, sophisticated model that will capture some substantial chunk from this theory. It should be the other way around, where the theory is generated by the experimental research. That's the pure inductive mode. More proposed markers of pseudoscience: a lack of replicability. This actually doesn't mean that it has been replicated. It means replicability, the ability to even attempt to replicate it. And that's going to stem from no generalizable data model. That means no formal format for how to collect a new data set. A data set is always based on a data model. And for example, a spreadsheet is a data model insofar as the definitions are included for what the rows represent and what the columns represent. And then the data set would be the actual content in the cells of that spreadsheet. Similarly, no generalizable instructions for experiment, meaning once you have a data set and once you have the idea of the model and the experiment out there, that you actually have a way to go back and reprocess the data, for example, using the predictive model and run the entire experiment from scratch. Instead, that would be either ad hoc instructions, how to repeat an experiment in a single case instead of generalizable case, or just no instructions at all, just claims for conclusions. This next one I actually enjoy quite a bit. I mean, personally, I like doing this. That is a koanic or meditation-like practice to learn rich concepts. That the theory is something that takes more and more and more reflection to understand or to learn, rather than merely driving the development of explicit predictive models that generate testable predictions. I love doing this. I love contemplating really rich ideas, particularly as it has to do with human behavior and tangible aspects of it, like, for example, anxiety and differentiation of self. But nevertheless, the theory has to be based on explicit predictive models so long as it's formal science. Another one is going to be predictable mandatory reference to a seminal thinker as opposed to the models, for example. Circular definitions within an in-group, that means where one concept depends on another concept that depends on the first concept. So, for example, a circular definition in another domain would be consciousness. I would certainly ask anyone who doesn't agree that consciousness has never been defined, anyone who thinks that consciousness has been defined objectively to some degree, to come up with a definition that's not circular. That would mean generally that consciousness, what I'm saying, the term consciousness usually is defined with some other term like awareness, and then that other term like awareness is the definition of that term depends on consciousness. Or consciousness means being self-aware. And what does self-aware mean? Well, it means being conscious. You can have three-way circular definitions and so on, but an objective definition is where that definition is going to not simply depend on the circular definition with another term, but it's going to depend on a separate term, probably from another domain of scientific research, and probably that has a directly observable or measurable definition. Another one is conflating a core construct with a value. That is, assuming that a construct or a concept in a theory is literally always good. That is going to be equivalent to a belief system, which is one of the major functions of religion, is to produce values, a value system. This goes back to Hume's is-ought problem, where science in the formal sense, and we are trying to talk about the most formal sense here for science, the science is going to be descriptive. It's going to just say how things work and try to do that in a predictive way. And then value systems are subjective opinions about what to do with it, what to do with that knowledge. This line is worthy of probably an entire book, if not an entire presentation. It's very subtle and it is kind of abstract, so it's difficult. But it more or less boils down to challenging someone that if they think that there is an objective basis for something being good, like survival, for example, that survival is always good, and that is the model, the explicit predictive model, that will always have good outcomes, for example, then it's easy enough to just find a counterexample. This has to do with one man's treasure is another one man's trash. That sometimes survival of a person is not necessarily ideal. Maybe there's more suffering. Maybe it leads to the survival. If they die, it leads to the survival of many other people. The point of this is that you very quickly run into problems with boundary conditions and ad hoc claims, ad hoc presentation predictions, where you have to actually limit the scope of the claim where survival is good. It has to depend on a specific set of people. It can be all people, it can be one person, it can be 5 people. But you have to actually take that model word for word and test it out in a different sample and see if it holds up. That's scientific research. And so if you say survival of all people is always good, then you run into a problem where there has never been a situation where all people will survive. There's also some people can survive and let other people live. Or if you say survival of one person is always good, but then they, like I said, can have 10 other people survive if they die, then it's just falsified. So there's all these problems, and it's very abstract with this one, but it's summed up by David Hume in the is-ought dilemma, is-ought problem. Science can say what is, but it can't tell you what you ought to do with it. The last one here is that concepts are only observable by an in-group. Now, obviously, all of these are double-edged swords, because what are you going to do with this last one if you actually have a theory that describes a variation in the degree to which people are able to observe reality? Well, naturally, you're going to have certain things that are more observable to some people than others. But this is pointing to an extreme where the concepts are only observable by an in-group, and that fact leads to a situation where no new knowledge is generated, and instead it's really more about the relationship system, which really is probably the underlying problem motivating this review of and proposition of markers of pseudoscience. That when pseudoscience is occurring, that scientific practice, that professional network, that theory, whatever it is, probably has more to do with maintaining those relationships, for example, having to do with status, social status, than it does with discovering knowledge about reality. An idea I got from Murray Bowen. In fact, my entire interest in this whole topic came from Murray Bowen. So there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of irony in this type of presentation. The second section is going to apply these ideas, these markers, to Bowen theory in particular. This title of this slide is Bowen's Fatal Flaws. Bowen used the term fatal flaw in relation to Freud, so I'm using it here to propose some of Bowen's own fatal flaws. There's no evidence that there is a single explicit predictive model for the theory itself. It's common enough to refer back to the regression experiment, where the experiment or the instructions given to the staff for certain very low functioning people was to give them all that they wanted, and that would allow the symptoms to abate, for example, at least for a time. And there is actually a pretty interesting explicit predictive model in that experiment. But that explicit predictive model does not bear formal weight for Bowen theory as a whole, or even the first 6 concepts. That picks off a very interesting and very rich but very small sliver of the total Bowen theory pie. There's a lot more that would need to be there to, for example, justify the claim that there is a child in a family that receives the majority of the anxious focus, and take that even further, that has something to do with the management of tension and anxiety between the parents, etc., etc., etc. The evidence for this is a logical deduction that occurred to me probably 2 years ago after a lot of thought about it. That when there are explicit predictive models that work, the market of ideas is such that they take the focus, not the people, not the research, not the mythology of the theory. It becomes all about the models. For example, I saw on TV probably 4 years ago on the news that some kid, some 16-year-old genius, came up with some way to detect lung cancer from imaging that was some relatively high number, and I'm not going to remember these, but it was like he could predict certain kinds of lung cancer from certain kinds of images at 80% instead of 40% or something like that. It was one of these where there was a clear added value to using his model, his predictive device, which was mechanical, it was explicit, over the existing technology. Now, when something like that occurs, and it's that clear, which is what an explicit predictive model provides, clarity and a certain amount of precision, that gets all the attention automatically. The people who are interested in that problem are going to focus more on the actual technology and accuracy behind the model than they are the mythology of lung cancer and the problem domain and all the people that are in there and any theories of lung cancer. It's about solving the problems. That's what gets the focus. If that existed for Bowen's work at NIM or anywhere afterwards at the Georgetown Family Center or anywhere else, that would be all anyone was talking about. It would not be the mythology of the NIM project, Murray Bowen himself and all of his different personality characteristics and values and training and letters, etc. It would be about the models. The models would represent the state of the theory. I'm saying it this way not only because I think that that's pretty helpful, but because I was interested in going back to the records of the NIM project to try to find any models or any data set. I even had a research proposal in place. I had letters of recommendation. I was going to go and look for those artifacts in the archives, which had just become available during my time in DC, and then COVID happened, and that was too bad. I couldn't do that. But while not in DC, while home in my home state, I started to think, wait a second, if those things were there, that would be all we were talking about. There's always a chance that there are those things there, but I'm not holding my breath. Not only that, but once I made that deduction or discovery, I started paying attention to the level of precision in the writing from Bowen and others that is so declarative about how things are, but doesn't provide the evidence. Or, and moving on to the next bullet here, that evidence would consist of raw data set that could be critiqued explicitly. You could actually go through specific examples and see if you agree that they comprise the proposition that there is a focused on child, and that does actually have something to do with the finality of the differentiation process, the maturation process, and that does have something to do with something like a basic self, et cetera, et cetera. You could pick all these apart one at a time. But there is no raw data set from the NIM project or any of the other projects where there was a unique availability of whole families that were there for long periods of time. Further, there is no formal data model to substantiate the claims of the theory from which a raw data set could be generated. So these are problems, these are flaws in the foundation of the theory today. That these are to be corrected, of course, and not just lamented. The next one has to do with conflating a core construct with a value, and that would be differentiation of self. I do believe that Bowen himself conflated the idea of differentiation of self of actual human value, something that is always good. I am proposing here, or reiterating from other authors out there in the world, that values are ideals and are not the same thing as science. That they can be constructed from science, but ultimately they are a matter of opinion. And that differentiation of self as a human value has a technical problem. This is a technical problem, not just an opinion about something that is not desirable here, this line item. The problem with it being a human value is that if it's always good, then there's no way to predict when it's occurring and when it isn't occurring. There's no way, there's going to be a million different ways to dissect it. It's going to be too complicated to be a predictive device. And this will, I think, become apparent to anyone who tries to come up with an objectively measurable definition for differentiation of self. I mean objectively measurable. It has too many pieces, and each of the pieces are too complicated. The functional differentiation, no pun intended, of the feeling system from the thinking system. It's an idea. It's a really interesting idea, but it's not measurable. The finality, or the distance that the individual has traveled down the pathway of maturity. I mean, that is a very complicated idea. There are other arguments against differentiation of self being conflated with a value. All those arguments would have to be is descriptive of when differentiation is good under certain circumstances and when it's not good. Of course, you'd have to define good and bad and that kind of thing. But an example of that is going to be sometimes too much differentiation too fast can kill somebody. That's not an uncommon claim in the theory. It's kind of a popular culture claim. It's not written so much. But that can happen. Or in the similar mechanism, I guess, that too much differentiation too fast is going to result in the change back response that has 3 predictable stages, hypothetically, that kind of thing. So those are examples that help differentiation of self become more scientific, because it really just has to do with predicting what occurs under specified conditions, rather than saying this thing is always good, now go for it, and go for it all the time. Once it becomes a value, it's not science. It's the ought on the sides of the is-ought problem. Now, a retrospective disclaimer that I'm going to give on that is that, like meditating on koanic theoretical concepts, I actually do really like the project of learning or speculating about the generation or the origin of human values in a scientific sense, especially in a biological sense. Values are like goals. They're like guidance. Values are things you aim at. Good values are things that or virtues are things that you aim toward. And sins or bad, undesirable things, negative values, are things that you aim away from. The proposition that there are shared values that are biologically generated, or the mechanisms that generate appraisals of certain kinds of outcomes, probably by way of positive and negative emotion, even though that can't directly be measured so well. That's an interesting project. So I say this with the most respect, that I do think that Bowen conflated differentiation of self with a human value, and that does create technical issues in the project of constructing explicit predictive models. In formal scientific research, it causes a lot of confusion. But the question of universal values or biological generation of values is an extremely interesting one. And I go back and forth on it being my favorite problem, actually. Favorite question. The last one here is a theory based on facts alone. This is a common phrase. He wrote this at least in his epilogue to Kerr's book. This phrase implies that Bowen theory stands on rock-solid foundation. And I think that it's easy for many people, new readers, old readers of Bowen theory literature, to take this for granted and take this as truth. Where a closer look into this is going to reveal problems here. What Bowen meant when he said a theory based on facts alone is that the theory is an attempt to explain observational facts. Those facts, most particularly from the NIM project and adjacent or subsequent projects at the Georgetown Family Center. And that would be in line with conventional science so far as almost everyone else in the globe would think of the term. That at least science is tasked with explaining observational facts. And the explanations are up for grabs, up for debate. You know, that's a matter of opinion until you've demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt using an explicit predictive model that you can predict whatever it is you're trying to describe. And that this is very important. The beginning with facts and the ending with facts, observational inputs and observational outputs of the modeling process, are very important to be absolutely universal. They have to apply to all humans, everybody on the street. And that is going to be a defining characteristic of science over a universal belief system where the observations or the concepts, the theory, only applies to a certain group of people. That this truth only applies to us, for example. So, beginning with facts is important. Now, the term fact has, I think, no real clear definition itself. And so I've thought about this for quite a long time. There are other people who have different definitions of fact. But so far as I can tell, in formal science, the term fact has a certain function. And that is that it is a universal belief. It's actually a belief that is good enough to be set aside to focus on other things. It's a universal belief. It's just something that we take as a provisional understanding that is clear enough, good enough, easy enough to accept for everybody to accept, that we can just say, all right, we're putting this aside. We're taking it as a basis to focus on other things now. We're not going to spend all our time verifying those, quote, facts. That's its belief, is to push things aside so you can focus your energy elsewhere on other questions, other opinions, actually. So that works, as I said, when what you call a fact actually is easily acceptable by the average person out there. Not just a person in a particular belief circle. But it has to be universal. And that is the depolarizing power of science that differentiates itself from religion. That you have to actually build something, an explicit predictive model that exists in material form outside of the human opinionated brain, and that the inputs for that model are factual in this definition, that everyone can agree on what's being passed into that predictive device, and that the output similarly has to do with fact. So in either case, it starts with fact and ends with fact. And that has led to the universal, depolarizing, global acceptance of this way of thinking and this standard that has led to the biggest explosion in human flourishing ever seen over the history of the species in the last few hundred years. And that everywhere it goes, the same thing happens. But when that term fact is eroded down into things that are more a matter of opinion, just like Bowen said about theory, concept, and hypothesis, then all of this starts to break down and it moves away from science. That things become polarized because polarization is the representation of opposing opinion, and that it loses its universality because of that. And fact literally functions as dogma, which means we know how things are because we know, and that's how we know. And you're wrong. And that this has more to do with maintaining relationship systems within the bias circle, that would be in Bowen theory, the inside of a triangle, against the others than it does with generating useful predictions about valuable problems and solutions to problems. And the last item on this list is that, just to reiterate, that by definition, theories, concepts, and models are not fact. They are inductions. They are opinions, and they're best guesses. A fact is a fact. A law is a law. Those are not opinion. Those are not theory, concepts, or models. The universal belief that has to be good enough to be set aside to focus on other things are fact. Some academic barriers, this is in the application of markers of pseudoscience to Bowen theory, that probably, the most important here, I think, maybe even the primary takeaway, at least in a cultural and academic level for Bowen theory, that there must be a distinction between research on one's own family and formal scientific research. Because when folks around the globe hear scientific research, or really just research, because most people think that research is scientific. Virtually all people think that research actually is scientific in the formal sense, when that word is used. That there has to be a separation between that and when somebody is applying the same research principles to becoming more objective about one's own family, about the extended family multi-generational system, and how that has shaped their perceptions and their current working model about the problems that they face, how it modulates the anxiety, which in turn modulates how quickly and precisely they move through life's problems. That these two kinds of research exist at far ends of the spectrum, of a spectrum of productivity, of efficacy, of quality. Only because that when someone goes and researches their own family, that they cannot hope to produce results that are formally verifiable, that make their way into an explicit predictive model, in the same way that formal research does with multiple sample sizes, where the researchers are not so close to the system as to be related to it, that they can proceed with more objectivity and dispassionate analysis. The reason that I've put this in here and promoted this here as probably the biggest takeaway for this presentation, at least this section of the presentation, is that if research is biased towards one's own family and conflated with formal research, then there will just be less progress in the formal sense, for all the reasons I just listed. But that doesn't discount the importance of research on one's own family, because the theory actually says that that's important and gives the differentiation of the thinking system and all of this kind of stuff against some, emotional reactivity as part of the product of a result, the product of the application of research principles. That the application of research principles is the same along this spectrum. The goal is to become objective about one's automatic reactivity through the application of research principles in the effort at differentiation of self and one's own family. But that is not the same as formal research towards explicit predictive models with sample sizes greater than 1 with sufficient statistical power to make formal scientific claims that end up in theory. The second one has to do with the use of academic terms, which implies a disconnection from the greater academic field. The over-reliance on peers who share the same bias, indicating some kind of a closed system. And this comes from my own experience in my doctoral program, because I knew enough Bowen theory going into it to get myself into trouble. And I can tell you that if you use the terms general systems theory, cybernetics, cause and effect, sort of, but also the triune brain and others, that you will be put into a basket of people who are out of touch with the current literature. These terms are in the past as far as the greater field of research psychology goes, research psychology being the field that is responsible for producing the explicit predictive models of human behavior, most formally. Now, the cause and effect one sort of applies. It has more to do with a semantic mismatch, where the use of this term in Bowen theory means linear causal relationships, as opposed to complex feedback loop driven chaotic systems, is another word from the Bowen theory vernacular, thinking. It basically implies that there's an oversimplistic way of thinking about a complex phenomenon. But the term cause and effect out in the greater world has many different uses. In some cases, it just has to do with thinking in terms of predictability, for example. And so this can be a conflation that can cause confusion more than anything. It doesn't necessarily put you in the basket of people who are using antiquated terms, who are out of touch with the rest of the field. Now, each one of these and the other antiquated terms I didn't include here, I will argue actually point to real problems in the field at large, in the field of behavioral health, for example, at large, that still exist. The way that these terms are defined in the Bowen literature, and so also in the Bowen academic system, still point to real problems. But the precise understanding of what those problems are, what the function of each terms in the academic world of Bowen theory is, I think is often or sometimes completely lost. And that would have to do with the over-reliance on these actual terms as opposed to merely the principles or the arguments that they're meant to make. So some brief breakdown of these. The general systems theory and cybernetics ones kind of go together. In the Bowen theory literature, those are used to indicate examples of where a theory, a theory is constructed by taking concepts from one kind of system and imposing them on another kind of a system. So for example, coming up with a theory about family using a pre-existing theoretical model. It's deducing how a family works from that pre-existing model and then using that deduction, the dictation from that pre-existing, for example, general systems or cybernetics model, to generate interventions for the family and then just seeing how it goes. And that's fine for experimenting with generating observations of change. However, the point in the Bowen theory literature that these terms are used to make is that is a different practice from doing natural systems research, which means just making observations and trying to come up with ways to explain those observations in a predictive fashion, explaining those observations directly. And for example, in the Berenson's interview with Bowen that's published in Bowen's book, Bowen was talking about the term triangle in that sense, that the idea with the term triangle is to just get a word that actually pertained to these particular kinds of observational examples, as opposed to the other ones that have to do with geometry and things like that. The other, triad, which has its other meaning in psychoanalysis and this kind of thing, or even the definition for triangle, people assuming it has to do with geometry and mathematics. That was essentially the fallacy that Bowen was saying that Bateson and Bertalanffy, etc., were making. Saying, oh, triangle, that's like a geometric thing, and so that means we can do math on it, which means you can do math on families in the same way, and that's not a good idea. That's a fallacy. That's what Bowen's saying. So that's the underlying principle. And the use of these actual words outside of the Bowen network indicates that indicates to people outside of the Bowen world that the person who's using them is using antiquated literature, because no one uses these terms anymore. Cybernetics a little bit, but not in the sense that it's used here, and not to do with human behavior necessarily. The triune brain one is, I won't be able to elucidate as much, but the triune brain as a structural theory is not used anymore. It's much more complicated than that, and using this term does indicate that a person is out of touch with the current literature. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't something still to the triune brain, possibly. For example, it's a good question about the function. When you're just talking about functional systems, regardless of where they exist in the brain, in structure, the triune brain is kind of interesting still, I think. Now, I haven't pursued this in great detail, but the idea that there is a part that is much older than the part that has to do with mammals, than the part that has to do with the human, is a pretty interesting idea. Some kind of an evolutionary phylogenetic spectrum there is an interesting thing. So that would be the underlying principle. It would have to do with function, not structure necessarily, and that the triune brain term is going to pretty much halt any conversation that's trying to seriously put forth the claims of Bowen theory outside of the circle of the Bowen world. Others here is the use of jargon. A little bit more of a nuanced topic. I mean, the terms anxiety and differentiation of self have definitions in Bowen theory that depend on each other, that are not quite the same as individualism, not quite the same as anxiety in psychiatry, which is always negative, it's always bad, it's very subjective. Emotion and feeling have different definitions in Bowen theory. Things like this cause semantic issues. And those semantic issues prohibited my communicating about cases in any substantial way with my peers in my grad program. Because when they heard anxiety or emotion, differentiation, triangle, whatever it was, that they heard different meanings than I was using. And so I would have to back off and just keep the conversation simple. It wasn't very substantial. We weren't talking about the claim that there was an anxious focus and that was impacting a kid, for example. It didn't get there. This other one I addressed earlier, that hypothesis testing is modeling, period. You're always using engineering skills, even if it's the engineering of statistical models, when testing hypotheses. And that Bowen did talk about getting beyond mathematics and things like that. And that's great, so long as that doesn't get in the way of formal hypothesis testing, because this presentation is about barriers to the formal world of scientific research in the context that the rest of the globe thinks of it. And then, of course, it does take too long to learn the theory for it to be portable. I don't want to downplay what I believe to be the importance of developing emotional objectivity and the toil that it does take for people to actually experience triangles and anxiety and how important it is for that to happen before you can really learn what the concepts mean. It is a dilemma. It's a dilemma. But at the same time, in the formal sense, in the formal scientific sense, the theory has to have more to do with the models. Has to do more with what's demonstrable, which is easily communicable. I mean, maybe a simulation model has 5,000 lines of code, and it does take a while to learn and think about. But at least those models pertain to known rules that are, a matter of consensus around the world. For example, math and the Python programming language, for example. And that it doesn't take 3 years just to learn those things before you can even take on the model. Right now, you have to take a long time to learn the concepts. And that's just a problem in the formal sense. These things need to be more portable. I'm going to chalk that up to the actual concepts and the theory just not being precise enough. Also, not that there's anything wrong with that. That's just the state of the theory. Because I'll say, as I said at the beginning of this presentation when I did it in person, I believe this theory like a religion. I really do. It took me a while to figure that out. I believe it like a religion. I do not believe it like a formal scientific theory. It's plausible as a formal scientific theory. The claims are really interesting. Otherwise, I wouldn't be giving this presentation. But the level of precision is not there. It has to be a belief system to be applied because it hasn't been proven. And a lot of these pieces haven't been proven formally, even in part. Now, just to play the other side of the table, the broader field has plenty of problems. Bowen theory proposes things that the broader field has yet to contend with. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. Remember that from Lilienfeld. But the field has a lot of problems that it basically ignores. I think for understandable reasons, but that doesn't mean they're still ignored. The biggest one is the fundamental claim in Bowen theory, which is that the family is involved in individual functioning. That the functional position of a person in their family system is descriptive of their ability to move through life's challenges with more or less efficient use of the resources at hand, and more or less progress or regress. I'm leaving out the vice versa here, that the individual is involved in the family functioning as well, because this is meant to be from the perspective of the broader field. Bowen theory claims that you cannot research individual behavioral functioning without researching their functional position in the family. That's a claim. And the field has yet to contend with this proposition. There is evidence. I think you can today actually make a formal claim that the family is implicated in functioning, individual functioning. People are just affected when their parents die, even if they don't talk to them. Of course, there's some cases there that are not. I have some examples in my family actually that are counterexamples, but they're edge cases, and we're talking about generalizable theory here. So that's a big one. I do think that if you talk to most clinicians who are not interested in Bowen theory for more than a couple of minutes, you can have them agree that they assume that family is important. But the de facto clinical training and the behavior of many clinicians, would quite often stand against that agreement. Because it's common enough that a clinician will push a client or suggest to a client that they cut off their family. Now, cutoff is an adaptation, so even Bowen theory isn't saying that's always bad. That would be a value, human value. No cutoff would be a human value. But in most cases, Bowen theory is going to say that that is going to be helpful and that it's encouraged, and that there is a degree of functioning that will not occur without it, actually. That's what Bowen theory is saying. So these are claims to be dealt with. There is an over focus on helping, certainly. this is me talking, this probably has something to do with the predominance of women in the field, and the predominance of people who fall along the dimension that Jonathan Haidt pointed out of possessing the value or the sacred value of care and harm, that is preventing harm to others. Now, obviously, that's going to make sense. I mean, with the field, with the clinical field, because it's the Hippocratic Oath not to cause harm. So it's understandable to a degree, but statistically speaking, women tend to fall more on that agreeable end of the spectrum in the big five sense. So my pointing out that there's an overabundance of women in the clinical fields is only based on that is probably going to have something to do with a stance to problems in clients that are accommodating versus opposing. That it's going to have more to do with being soft towards people rather than aggressive, for example, and even in a productive sense, aggressive. And that Bowen theory is making the claim that it is quite possible and actually more easy to overhelp than it is to truly help someone in the long run be more productive in their own goals. For example, attachment theory is kind of the de facto clinical theory, I guess, today. It's the thing that's most popular. It's what people talk about the most. It's got plenty of research going towards it. Secure attachment is the goal in attachment theory, but there is not a limit on how much attachment there is. There is not nomenclature in the attachment literature that has to do with over-focus, that has to do with the parent, usually the mother, the primary caregiver, giving too much attention to the child, which really has more to do with their own anxiety or distress or overwhelm or discomfort than it does to do with realistic problems in that child. I'm focusing on this here because my observation, and this is just an opinion, in clinical training was that there were many parents that I saw who did not have a way to limit how much attention they were giving their kids, and that they were trying to over-accommodate and over-appease, over-praise, over-attach to their kids with no way of thinking about how to set boundaries, how to say no, how to allow their kids to suffer when necessary to learn. So that's an interesting one. Haidt's research is very interesting on the care, harm, sacred value. There's, of course, lack of validity in the DSM. There's no consistent theoretical framework throughout the field, and no framework behind the DSM. The DSM is assumed to be a theoretical framework. I think from what I can see, a lot of colleagues outside of the Bowen network at least, because there's an underemphasis on the DSM and the Bowen network, a lot of colleagues are interested in the DSM and in psychopathology courses because with the assumption that it explains something about behavior, that it can give something predictive and a model to use. But there actually is no underlying theoretical model of the DSM. It's a categorical descriptive model with no etiology. Basically no etiology. It's statistical in the sense, and this is in the 12-page introductory chapter of the DSM-5, not introductory chapter, but the introduction, that they have statistically validated that psychiatrists agree on those diagnoses. That is not science in the predictive sense, in the explicit predictive model sense. And I'm not sure that many people know this. In 2013, the NIH said that they're no longer funding research that is exclusively based on the DSM. That was 2 weeks before the release of the DSM-5. Interesting coincidence. And they're promoting their RDoC framework as an alternative, which is a purely data-driven framework that's atheoretical as well, but the idea is that the theories will follow the models. Hypothetically, that would be in line with the thesis of this presentation as formal science. But we'll see how it gets there. There is, and jumping down to the last one before the second to last one, because they're out of order. There is a problem in the broader field that the broader field has yet to contend with, that most clinical theories actually are implicit. What I mean by that is that I'm using the term clinical theory here to be the working model that a clinician actually uses to understand the problem in front of them, inferred through their behavior. And that's because the theory itself, the logical understanding that clinician is using to explain the problem that their client is having, that guides that clinician's work, is implicit. It hasn't been explicit or explicated. It hasn't been written down. And I believe because it's mostly intuitive. And actually, most of my clinical training in my own PsyD program had to do with intuition. The opposite of intuition would be a formal theory that's written down that generates hypotheses that are actually tested in formal research through explicit predictive models. Bowen theory points out this problem. Bowen himself pointed out this problem, and by the way, for what it's worth, I found this extremely helpful in my training. To realize that how I thought about a problem determined what I was going to do about it. And that most people actually haven't thought about their own theoretical basis for their behavior. The result of this is going to be that there are many things that a clinician does that are contradictory, because that's the nature of something that remains implicit, that remains intuitive, not on paper, but just in your body and mind. That it has to do more to do with acting on impulse than it does to do with science. And that finally, this second to last bullet that should be the last one, that this represents a mismatch between the mandate from the APA, the American Psychological Association, that all clinical practices should be evidence-based. There's a mismatch between evidence-based practice and reality, because most clinical behavior remains based on implicit clinical theories. So I got this idea from Bowen of making explicit, formal arguments for how I thought my clients worked, so that those could be picked apart, because we're asking the same thing of the clients, to think through how they understand the problems that they have, so that that can be laid out and evaluated for weaknesses, so that you can improve it, because that is what guides behavior. Those working theoretical models, whether they're implicit or explicit, both in the client and the clinician. So these are problems. There are others, but Bowen theory has many strengths. All right, ending up here, I'm going to propose here that you get by all of this. You at least buffer strongly against it when the focus is on explicit predictive models. Got to build something. It has to predict via simulation the phenomenon at hand. If someone claims to understand how the human family works, something needs to be built that simulates a human family. And the degree of claim, the strength in the claims that can be formally made about what is known about the human family, can only be backed up by what's been demonstrated in the models. And as I said, that formal research is not the same thing as one's own family. This exclamation point equals sign in computer science means not equal. Formal research in the scientific sense, the kind that's funded, the kind that meets the criteria that the entire world these days assumes that you are using when you say research, definitely when you say scientific research, it's not the same thing as research on one's own family in the degree of the quality of the results. Differentiation of self is a terribly subjective process. The goal is to get objective. The effort is to get objective. It is to do that by applying research principles from formal research, but on one's own functioning in one's own family, to activate the thinking system, challenge assumptions through experimentation and planning. But it is not reasonable to expect that kind of, quote, research to produce the same results as formal research. If I am ever wrong about this, I would love to see it. I would love to be proved wrong about this, because Either it would indicate a case where someone was extremely talented, and then we could learn what went into that, or it would make it so that more people could take advantage of the unbelievable availability of data in one's own family. No one has more access to the data on a family than the people in it. And so that's an advantage, but you're too close to the emotional process. It's too subjective anyway to actually produce formally scientifically verifiable predictions that actually apply across families or across timestamp samples over the chronology of data in one family. Either way, it's more than one sample size. I'm going to argue here that because this theory is so complicated, because the claims, the richness of the claims, the complexity that is described, basically through the feedback loops between the family members, if not between the various systems and the individual, that technology is required to simplify the actual formal scientific arguments that are put up to good faith critics. That because there is such detailed data that's required, voluminous and detailed data, that there has to be a way to perform very detailed data entry and management. You've got to be able to go edit and maintain and sculpt a data set about one family, about multiple families. And that the technology must then take that very detailed data set and simplify it into dynamic visualizations so that someone who doesn't share the bias of the theory can understand the argument that's being made without going through all the data and understanding the theory and taking 3 years of a course and devoting all this time to understand the theory. The actual scientific argument has to start and end with fact as input and output. And so that has to be simplified into a visualization that puts all of that on animated screen, on a dynamic animation. That was and is the goal of the family diagram app that I built. The idea was to provide a detailed data entry device that then made it possible to simplify the synthesis of that data into a dynamic visual. You can find more information about that at familydiagram.com. It's free for one family, and then there's a paid license for multiple families, implying that a person is a professional, probably. That to progress towards explicit predictive models, that there has to be many individuals entering many cases into this app. Individuals who have different perspectives about family, different hypotheses, but accumulating lots of data. The focus here is on data. Data has to exist before the explicit predictive models can be used to attempt to evaluate and make sense of the data. So many, many more individuals entering many cases. Go download the app, do your own family for free, raise problems, raise questions, get a lot of data. That's what's got to happen. That if that's occurring, then some few cases of quality will bubble to the surface. This has happened among the many cases that I've done clinically. A few of them have come to the surface as being viable potentially for making a formal scientific claim about what's going on in that family. And that the goal would be to clean those up, maybe to obscure some identifying information, and make a video case formulation that an emotional process has occurred in that family that is under 3 minutes, ideally 2 minutes, because when you really get down to the minimum data for a case formulation to say, this was the focused on child, this is the state of this triangle, this is how anxiety went up, it coincided with this symptom, it coincided with the remission of this symptom, that kind of thing. It actually is not that complicated in most cases, but it takes clarity on the part of that researcher, on the part of that clinician, to make that argument in simple form to a good faith critic. And a good faith critic is going to be someone who is more interested in reality than confirming or denying your argument. It's not, in this case, it's not going to be somebody who is interested in Bowen theory. It's going to be a physicist, somebody who understands formal science, but does not share the bias. It doesn't take that long to make these theoretical claims, to get all the duplicated data out of there, for example, and the excess of data, and just get it down to what's needed for the formal argument. If this were to happen in any great volume, a number of these video case formulations stored over many family diagram files, then it would be possible to aggregate those quality cases into a database and categorize them, organize them in some way, index them so that people could come back and ask questions. But it's important to point out that this end of the spectrum of formal science, not just research on one's own family, is not fun. That is to say, it's not fun for people who are not already interested in really detailed technical work, really nerdy about data and about building things. You know, there are the people who go into research as a career, they really like going down these rabbit holes, hopefully anyway. But this is not going to be fun for the average clinician or the average clergy or the average organizational consultant who tend to prefer dealing with people and rather than pursuing these technical projects. But just pointing this out, that is what it takes. It takes a lot of conscientious rigor and attention to detail to do this. Finally, here's the challenge. I challenge anyone who believes Bowen theory to be factual even, if not verified, and to have a scientific basis already, to argue one case in simple form in under 3 minutes. I would suggest doing this in the app because it does simplify very large and detailed data sets into dynamic visualizations. It makes it possible to edit on that timeline and get all of that into a simple visual animated diagram. But it doesn't necessarily require that. In fact, it would be better if you didn't need technology. But I challenge anyone to argue one case presentation or one theoretical formulation that an emotional process has occurred in one family, in a particular family, in under 3 minutes, ideally 2 minutes, to only include the minimum necessary data to really have a clean set of data to form that argument on. And I think that it's impossible to make a 3 minute or even definitely a 2 minute video of any substance without already making sure that it has the minimum information in there. That this would be then presented to a good faith critic, like a physicist, who does not share the bias of Bowen theory, but is interested in discovering reality, more than agreeing or disagreeing with you. And to use a generalized formula, not an ad hoc formula. So not if Susie stands up to Johnny, Johnny will initially respond with agitation and then calm down later, and then the family will settle into a lower baseline of chronic anxiety and take some of the attention off the kid, and the kid's behavior problems will, what's another name? Brian, the kid's behavior problems will abate. That's an ad hoc formula that applies to that family. But to use a generalized formula, one that applies literally, word for word, to all families, to some degree even, that's fine. So to put this all together, to make a video, do it under 3 minutes, get the data clean, present it to someone who doesn't share the bias, and to do it 3 more times with 3 more cases. Prove it. Prove that it's there, that it can be done. I would love to see an example if that was the case. So that's it. That's all I've got. I appreciate your attention. FamilyDiagram.com is where you can find the app. And I think the more data that can be jammed through that thing, the better. It doesn't even have to be paid for. And I would love to see more progress if anybody has any to offer. Thank you very much.